if regenerative agriculture has X% IRR and it can remove vast amounts of carbon, why don't we just put $1 trillion into that right now? Everyone makes money and we solve climate change. What that means is that you're able to unlock financing for the project that wasn't there before. So what can happen is you can either have a corporate that wants the future carbon credits invest upfront into the project, and then they will be the partner in the project and they will have the future carbon credits used to offset their emissions. Or you can have a player that wants to pay for the carbon upon delivery, an offtake agreement, and then you have a contract that is essentially a receivable, and then you can take that to a bank and get the financing up front. The middle strata is typically acai for us, so a palm tree that is partially shade tolerant, but not as shade tolerant as the understory species, and occupies a space, a niche in the system that is not occupied by another type of tree. And then our high strata is timber species or woody species. A 3D goggle set next to the food where you can see the farm, you can visit the farm where it was grown at and say, okay, this is coffee from a regenerative agroforestry farm, a conventional farm. People will make the decision on their own if they can just be there and see.
This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, where we learn more on how to put money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems, while making an appropriate and fair return.
Welcome to another episode. Today we talk about large-scale reforestation and conservation through agroforestry, meeting the growing demand of climate-positive food, ingredients, and noble hardwood and carbon credits. Welcome, Philip.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. My favorite podcast.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's a good way to start this one. And there's a lot to unpack, not only in your title or let's say the subtitle on the website, and of course the documents I went through to prep. But let's start with the personal question. You know it's coming because you've listened to this podcast. We've had the honor that you are a listener. And actually, prime, I won't say target because it sounds wrong, but like an ideal case in the sense of people that have experience elsewhere, in this case in finance, and bring that to the regeneration space, and then hopefully use us and other resources to speed up their knowledge and to get to know a space through the pioneers and the practitioners we like to put in, let's say, invite on our couch and put on the spotlight. And through that, hopefully speed up your own development and see, okay, where are things that need to be built and how, and then at some point, hopefully you come here and talk about that. It's a nice circle. I have to say, but start with the personal question. How come you spend most of your waking hours focusing on noble hardwood, which I'm definitely going to ask more questions about, like agroforestry in Brazil? Like that's quite a specific piece of the regeneration path. And even like, how did you stumble upon regeneration and ended up spending so much time on it?
Thank you for the question. So essentially, since a young age, I've had an interest in impact investing, or this sort of combination of impact and potential financial returns, and how businesses can do good and do well at the same time. And so it started off with an interest in microfinance, got very into Muhammad Yunus as a 16-year-old. I studied sort of impact investing in microfinance in college at Cornell, which led me to spend time abroad in Spain and in Chile. And then, once I was in Latin America, I visited Brazil and fell in love with the continent and Brazil specifically. And, fast forward from there, I wound up working at Goldman Sachs in investment management in New York, getting advice from people saying like, hey, don't go necessarily directly into impact, learn some things, and then you'll be able to have, higher leverage to be able to do what you want to do long term.
Such a good point and such a dangerous one, because there's just a book that came out in the Netherlands about like the Bermuda Triangle of talent, that people say that, and go to McKinsey or go to Goldman or go to whatever sector you're in, and then you for 2 years or 3 maybe, and then you have this experience, and then you can do so much more good to the world. The problem is most people get stuck, and the golden cage and the lifestyle and the money, and they're very good at keeping you there. And let's say the impact of the average person in all of those companies, not picking on one, is pretty low. And somehow you stepped out. Like, how did you escape from the golden cage?
Well, it was a process. I think for me that the risk was low because I've always been someone that really wanted to be my own path and really do my own thing. And so I was becoming very, very interested in getting down to Latin America and being on the ground and making an impact down here, and was able after a couple of years to learn Portuguese during my free time living in New York, and came down to Brazil to work for a private equity fund. And there I was able to gain operating experience. And Brazil started off at the fund level, but then went inside of 2 different portfolio companies that we controlled to help manage those businesses and create value, which was a really, really interesting experience. And then from there, I sort of got the ability to get into what I would consider the impact space. So tangentially, the second portfolio company from the private equity fund, the first was a renewable energy company. The second one was actually a fashion brand. And I got contacted by one of my friends from Cornell University, who's an investor, said, hey, I just met these people from Dallas, Texas. They're creating a startup to really empower the influencer economy. And it's a new career. These women have great ambitions and they need a digital infrastructure to help them build out that career and focus on doing what they love and be able to quit their day jobs and just live their life and spur, true female entrepreneurship. And they need somebody to basically open and run this in Latin America. And so I went up, flew up to Dallas, got to know the founders, Amber and Baxter, incredible people, and then decided to launch this business in Latin America, wound up being, very successful. The company's now worth, $2 billion. We were running, $40 million in sales in Brazil, thousands of female entrepreneurs. But I felt that there was more impact to be had. And looking at the climate crisis every day, I was ready to after 7 years of running that business, ready to really dedicate my entire life to fighting the climate crisis. A couple of different influences there. My wife was already acutely aware of this, vegetarian. One of my best friends was creating a documentary called Feeding Tomorrow, which if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend it. And I was really thinking about the opportunities that are related to this intersection of climate and land use and food. And
why was that? Because the step from renewable energy, influencers, female entrepreneurship, there's a gap to the food space and the ag space. Feeding Tomorrow obviously as a documentary helps. Do you remember what, not the click was, but what the insight was like, okay, food and ag is a sector that desperately needs change and will change if we like it or not.
Yeah, I think it was a number of people that influenced me, but I would say definitely my wife and my friend Oliver were the ones that were there. I think the moment was, Oliver's the son of actually a relatively famous chef. He was about to open a restaurant that was actually going to be a burger restaurant. And then at some point he had like a huge reckoning and awakening of like what was going on in his life. And then like the next time I saw him, he was a vegetarian. And so it was a very, very just interesting time. I was very uneducated on the subject at the time. Like, okay, what do you mean climate and food? And then we went down this rabbit hole. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And so, and so very much learning about regenerative agriculture, sustainable, all practices, sustainable grazing, agroforestry, et cetera. And it became so obvious that this was a solution that can help reverse climate change, repair ecosystems, and also have a financial return. So I said, okay, if regenerative agriculture has X% IRR and it can remove vast amounts of carbon, why don't we just put $1 trillion into that right now? Everyone makes money and we solve climate change, next year, it's done. And of course, then
that turned out to be so easy. Now we're at 10 trillion. Yeah,
exactly. And now, exactly. And so
it's the after story, people. We don't ask the $1 billion. We just ask, what did you do with 10 trillion? We're going to do a series like in 20 years. What did you do with that billion? Or how did we get to $1 trillion? Or anyway, but like, when did you see the financial potential? Because for many, it's not. I'm not saying not there, but it's always a tricky. I sort of see 2 streams: the people that are really showing and seeing that there is an interesting risk-adjusted financial return and saying like we could put trillions to work in this, not tomorrow, but like over time, definitely grow there. How do we make this bankable, institutional investors, etc. And Regen Ag has to sort of fit into the current financial world and probably could in a certain context or in a certain flavor. And then there are people that we have to completely change the current financial system to fit regen or regeneration in its deepest core, and we need both, and we have both on this show. But you're clearly saying, I see financial returns. When did that? Where did you see that, or when did you like? Oh, this actually makes a lot of financial sense.
Yeah, so there's actually plenty of scientific studies and even some books that have studied agroforestry systems where they're looking at the costs and they're looking at the upside and putting it into like a financial model and saying, okay, this is the payback, this is the upfront cost, this is the IRR, et cetera. And I always found it to be quite attractive, especially considering it's inflation adjusted, and non-correlated to other asset classes.
Specifically agroforestry.
Specifically agroforestry,
right? Yeah.
was what I was looking at. And in pretty much all of the studies, they didn't have the carbon credit component to it, which made me think, okay, well, now we're in a world where a low carbon product for insetting or a carbon credit for offsetting is being valued. So these returns, which were, I guess, they were acceptable, but not attractive compared to others, straight down the middle type of investments that are a lot less risky and a lot more liquid. But once you add in the carbon credit piece to it, then all of a sudden you had a change for that a new piece of information that agroforestry didn't have for the past 10,000 years, and all of a sudden it could be a new moment for agroforestry. And I think that all clicked once we started to see the carbon market pick up again, probably in 2020 essentially.
And how did your experience in renewable energy help with that? Because basically trees are a lot of solar panels picking up and doing a lot of things with it, not electricity, obviously. And actually also electricity. But there are a lot of ex-renewable energy people or still renewable energy people I see coming into the ag and food space, and they see a lot of similarities to maybe 10, 15 years ago, depending on the context in the country, etc., where you were in terms of subsidies, in terms of power purchase agreements, in this case, offtakes, like a lot of things click into place, different sector, but this became bankable basically in the last few decades. What did your experience in Brazil running or being deeply involved in this renewable energy company teach you or helped you shape the agroforestry space?
Yeah, a hugely relevant experience. I would say that the first and most important is really around the financial structure of how you would structure a business like that. So the way that Courageous Land is structured, there's like very similar to a lot of renewable energy companies, which is also not so different from real estate or traditional energy probably, which is there's...
Let's not invent too many things at the same time. Yeah,
exactly. There's like a holding company, let's say, and then you can have project finance for specific projects, whether it's a wind farm or a solar farm or an agroforestry farm. And the type of investors that are at the two different, let's call it legal entities are quite different profiles, right? So you might have a holding company that's venture or early private equity backed that wants really asset efficient or low assets, capital efficient, highly scalable, and sort of high risk, high return returns. Whereas project finance, big institutional investors, very long sales cycle in terms of getting deals done, but huge amounts of capital that accept lower returns and lower risk. And so I think that this is probably one of the most important learnings. The other thing is really just understanding the different types of financial structures that can be associated with agroforestry or renewable energy in general, right? You can list mature vehicles once they're sort of de-risked and cash flow producing. You have earlier stage projects that are a different profile of investor. And in Brazil, the capital markets are quite sophisticated and deep, very much like the United States, probably a little bit less, obviously. But it's interesting the way that you can structure deals and make things happen and unlock capital in a way that the investors are in the appropriate place and getting the return and the risk that they're looking for.
Yeah, I think it's a deeply neglected, I was going to say misunderstood, but it's happening. Neglected piece of the puzzle of how to structure these type of projects, and not even structure one, but how do you structure number one, number two, number three? What's the path? Like behind me, I don't know if you're watching this video, but there's a scale, like there's stairs behind me, which makes this very appropriate. But this is not a linear path. Like it's the first project is going to be too small to pay for the cost, but it's going to make a lot of sense. And the second project is going to be bigger, and then you eventually get to the 100 million, the 500 million, etc., etc., etc. But you have to already think in 10, 20 steps. And that's for many, I think, entrepreneurs and also agroforestry developers or developers in general, unless you come from that space, this is not a natural feeling, because your investors in the first vehicle and the second vehicle are going to want to know, like, who's going to be investor number 6 and number 5. Like, do you have them lined up? Because then we can just keep going, and the holding company makes a lot of sense. And all of those bank, like, what's the road to bankability? Like, was a vague term, but like, what's the road to getting project after project in the ground going, and how do you unlock that? And that's something we don't talk about very often when we talk about get more trees in the ground, productive trees, restore water cycles, and all of that. What was your first attempt, like when you said, okay, after running the influencer company for, and not using it as a negative term.
Yeah.
We're trying to influence. We're an influencer in a much smaller level.
Absolutely.
For 7 years, what was your first like step into the world of agroforestry and finance?
Yeah, I mean, so finance, started back a long time ago, but agroforestry really came on strong in 2020 at the beginning of COVID, as many stories began, right? So I became...
You started baking and planting trees.
Minus the bakings, but the tree planting became on fast and hard. So essentially, I realized that this was a tremendous opportunity for my life, a tremendous opportunity for making an impact that's positive, doing what I really wanted to do, being the best version of myself, and just went down the path of studying everything I absolutely could on agroforestry, including searching keyword agroforestry and podcast apps and listening to your podcast and some of your guests, and reading scientific papers, reading books, got a textbook, which I think was a university course on agroforestry, read through the whole thing. So, and then most importantly, really just visiting people in the field and talking to them. And so I knew from the very beginning I needed a co-founder that would be an operational co-founder, because my background is in sort of the finance and platform building, which we'll get into for agroforestry.
Who's going to believe that you know how to plant trees at scale? Yeah,
exactly.
That's a
No, it's not even that. It's like you need complementary skill sets in order to run like a large and complex business. And so yeah, made a list of 100 different agroforestry projects on an Excel spreadsheet, like where they are.
Perfect place though, of course. Like Brazil is like, I think people. I've never been, first of all, and I know, but it is the Silicon Valley, the Mecca, the whatever hotspot of
100%.
agroforestry at scale. Super deep syntropic to large scale onto arable, like there's machinery, history, 10,000 years, as you mentioned before, all the way to now 40 years of iron and scourge, et cetera, et cetera. Like it is, you were at the right place at the right time.
Absolutely. And it was luck in a lot of ways. Because when I learned about agroforestry, I tried to say, like, where would the best place to do this be? And it just so happened to be the country I'd been learning how to run businesses in for a long time now. And so very, very lucky, right place, right time. And yeah, I got to know a bunch of these projects. I visited them, I took courses, and at the very top of my list was Gilberto and Terra and Luisa Avelar, who wound up being my co-founders, who have been doing this for quite a long time. And we decided to go into business together and really scale this. And happy to tell the story or the details, whatever you want to get into.
Yes, please. Now, how do you, because you visit these of the 100, maybe end up visiting 50. I don't know, I'm just a random number.
Yep.
And then how do you, because I think many people from outside the space who want to start something is like, how do I find a co-founder that has that deep, let's say, sector knowledge or deep practitioner knowledge that can really complement? And not how do you find it, but how do you convince someone that you're serious? Mm-hmm. Because we also see a lot of people, let's say, quote unquote, the tourists in the space that have seen finance and have seen 2 documentaries and think they know how to do regen ag at scale and try to raise a lot of money. How? I mean, you read all the papers, which helps. You read all the books and everything that's there on agroforestry. How did you convince your co-founder that you were serious and you were the real deal?
Yeah. So first, I'll start by saying how I found the co-founders, and then how eventually was able to convince them to start the company.
If any convincing was needed.
Exactly, which it actually wasn't, which was great. So. The first thing I did is I set up an Instagram account dedicated to agroforestry, called it Courageous Land, and started following different agroforestry projects with the intention of letting the algorithm do the work that it does, which was suggesting all sorts of agroforestry projects and regenerative projects across Brazil and the world. So in a very short period of time, I was following, I think, all of the agroforestry accounts that could be followed. So
whenever somebody new popped up, you were like, the algorithm was like, oh, we have to give this to Philip because this is what he wants.
Exactly. Well, people that follow this account also follow this account, and it just so happened to be a lot of agroforestry. So from there, I was able to put on a spreadsheet all of the projects that I could find in the Americas, really, and see what they were planting, where they were, their size, whatever information I could gather, and then I made a short list of potential players to visit. People to visit, farms to visit, projects to visit, etc. And Gilberto and Luisa were at the top of the list. They were doing a combination of sort of commodity crops, specialty crops, and timber at a nice scale. And so I visited them. Well, first of all, I reached out to them sort of cold reach out saying, hi, I'm Phil. I'm really interested in scaling agroforestry. Here's a little bit about my background. I'm really interested in what you guys are doing and potentially working with you, either having you as a consultant or potentially beyond that. And was very lucky because they responded and said, sure, come and visit. And it was good timing because I was able to visit them at a time when they were in Bahia, but they were already splitting their time between Bahia and the northeast of Brazil on the Atlantic coast. And the other half of their time was in the state of Roraima in the Amazon. And anyway, went up to Bahia. I got to talking to them and we hit it off immediately. They were already working on the early stages of a 10,000 hectare plan, which was the biggest I've ever heard of for agroforestry. And so our idea of scale and ambition matched each other. Their skill set was very much running farms, operations, managing the people, the processes, and the plants. And my skill set was very much in helping them, let's get the financing for this in place and let's sell the production to the buyers. And let's create technology to make this scalable and eventually help other people do agroforestry through partnerships with Courageous Land. And it was a very good match and very good complementary skill sets and alignment in the mission. And so we decided to go into business together almost immediately. I will say that I think in terms of advice to other people looking to find co-founders, the understanding the end goal and a very long-term vision of what their potential co-founder wants is really important early on, because I've seen cases where somebody's doing something at a 20-acre scale and they have the skill sets to really scale it, but they don't want to. That's not their personality. They know it's going to involve a lot of stress and a lot of work, and they just don't want to do it. Which is fine. Exactly.
Yeah. Don't feel pressure to do, even though for this sector and for all of us, it would be great if you have the skill set to do it at that scale. Yeah, let's not burn out as well. Yeah.
Exactly. So really just aligning on what's your dream for 10 years from now? And if that matches with your dream, then it's a pretty good start.
And so that 10,000 hectares, was that already bought? Like where you said, my involvement or my interest is in the offtake, in the financing. Like what was the stage you got involved basically, or you started working on that together?
Yeah, so they had received, before I met them, a RFP, a request for proposal from Fundo Valley, which is a nonprofit in Brazil that is probably the most important financier of agroforestry projects in the country. And they had a goal of really helping people dream bigger and think bigger. And they got some initial seed funding for this type of project. And so they already had to submit a proposal that was accepted for what a 10,000 hectare roadmap could look like, with some initial grant funding up front and then eventually becoming more self-sustaining from a financial perspective. And so that project wound up merging essentially with Courageous Land, and that was the genesis of Courageous Land. So we were already born with a project in Bahia and a project in the Amazon, essentially.
And so now we're talking April or almost May, actually, end of April 2025. What is Courageous Land now, if you had to, not to give the elevator pitch, is always such a usual one, but let's say you're at a dinner table and somebody on your left or right asks, what do you do in between plates? What's the, in between servings, what's the normal go-to explanation you share?
We'll start with the missions. Our mission is to help reverse climate change, but do so in a way that creates health and abundance. And abundance is a great word for what we're trying to do for all of life on Earth. And we have to remember that life on Earth involves not only biodiversity, but also humanity. And so we're really trying to solve climate change, create health, create abundance as we do this. There's multiple ways to solve climate change, but there's not multiple ways to solve climate change while also creating abundance, health, etc. And so we do this through large-scale agroforestry systems that are optimized for production, which therefore gives you financial returns, and carbon removal, which helps you reverse climate change. And it also has the co-benefits of creating income for local communities, helping create habitat through biodiversity, restore the water cycle and guarantee water availability, food security, et cetera, et cetera. So how we do it is essentially reforesting degraded lands. So areas that used to be forest a long time ago, that at some point they were chopped or burned down, are currently typically a degraded pasture with no trees and very little production. So very low.
And a few cows here and there.
Yeah, a few cows here and there. So not being used well from a financial standpoint nor an ecological standpoint. And we can...
Underperforming ecosystems, I think. The Savory Hub in the Nordics would call that something.
Exactly. So it's not good financially and it's not good ecologically. And so what we can do is we can plant a biodiverse set of trees that will produce fruits, nuts, timber, carbon credits, and increase the income on that land by at least 10x per hectare per year in terms of revenue, and also can increase the ecological function from something that is absolutely degraded to something that gets close to the native forest, but not all the way, of course, because we're planting things that needs to be able to produce, and there's a certain amount of sunlight that's needed for fruit species.
And is it ever a tension, like the carbon piece with let's say what the production side wants? So when you look at the agro part of agroforestry and the carbon part of carbon credits, like is there a tension there? Is there a nice sweet spot where both are, let's say, very happy in terms of the amount of carbon credits you can generate and the amount of production you can get out of a system?
That's a wonderful question. And the answer is yes, there is absolutely a trade-off. If you have full maximum carbon, so every forest landscape has what's called a carrying capacity, which is the maximum amount of carbon that you can store in the biomass. It's like a mature forest in the Amazon has, X tons of carrying capacity in the biomass.
Which is a model, I'm imagining, not a actual measurement, or it's an actual measurement including soil and the whole thing?
Well, you have the carrying capacity of the above ground biomass, the below ground biomass, and the soil. So you have carrying capacity of each of the carbon pools, and then you have a total carrying capacity, which beyond that is impossible to stock more carbon because it's what the land and the weather supports, basically.
But is that based on a model or is it based on reality? In a sense, like,
it's
do
based
they
on
come and
reality.
measure?
Yeah. This is that you can find this on the internet. The carrying capacity of XYZ biome is there. So if you hit the carrying capacity, your production of fruits or food in general will be low because there's not enough sunlight getting through to the understory. You can produce fruit that the overstory or the emerging strata is getting enough sunlight, things like Brazil nuts, etc. But below that would be relatively limited production. And then you start to, let's say, have more light and you get more production, but less carbon. So there's a trade-off there. And carbon, another way to think about it is also wood. So you have this trade-off between timber production and fruit production or food production. My co-founder, Gilberto specifically, has spent his life to finding this like optimal point of carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and production, and the right way to model it. So the way that we do agroforestry is multi-strata agroforestry, where the lower strata is typically coffee or cocoa, or in some cases lime. So something that is shade tolerant. Then we have a middle strata, which is typically a palm
Probably
tree.
produces better quality under shade, right?
Absolutely.
And there's a quality market. We've learned that with Fernando. So there's a quality market for coffee already established. You don't need nutrient density research, etc. You hit the specialty market with enough of your percentage of your coffee, and your returns are very different, or your margins are very different than if you go in a commodity space. So that's coffee, cacao. I think it's the same. Lime, I don't know.
Yeah.
But they thrive under shade, and you get access to different quality markets, and thus very different prices.
Absolutely. And the good thing is you also don't depend on, let's call it the premium market. You could also just sell the coffee in the commodity market or the cocoa in the commodity
There's
market.
always a buyer. Yeah.
There's always a buyer. Exactly. So that's our lower strata. The middle strata is typically acai for us, or a variation of acai. So a palm tree that is partially shade tolerant, but not as shade tolerant as the understory species, and occupies a space, a niche in the system that is not occupied by another type of tree. And then our high strata is timber species or woody species. And the way to do the woody species in order to optimize wood production and also carbon sequestration is to have a mixed stand with multiple kinds of timber species that grow at different rates. So that way you can have a steady supply of timber over time, that you will never do a clear cut where you have to start over, you're back to the grass that you started with, but you'll selectively harvest 1 or 2 species per hectare or a couple trees per hectare starting year 20 on. So some species will be ready for harvest in year 18, other ones in year 22, other ones in year 25, others 40, all the way up to year 50. And so you can have a staggered approach where you're harvesting timber, creates a little bit more light for the fruit trees, and then you replant. And so you have continuous cover forestry. Once it's a forest, it's always a forest.
Such a good bridge to the interview with Paul McMahon with that, I think the week before this. In Ireland and not in Brazil, Ireland, the UK, Poland, I think, a number of European countries, but very similar, very, let's let's say, intelligent way of doing forestry is the continuous side, and a very interesting way in terms of planning out cash flow and like not being dependent on hopefully high prices in year 20, and actually they are not high prices and we have to wait a number of years. Like this is seems a much more intelligent way to build a model as well.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that we talked about the carrying capacity. When you do timber in that way, you can actually sequester far more carbon than the carrying capacity over time. Why? Because you'll selectively harvest timber that's specific for long-lived wood products. Like, I don't know if you have a video here, but like this,
like your wall,
like in my wall right here, exactly. So you can remove some carbon from the area and put it into a wood product, which could last for generations, like construction, fine furniture, etc., freeing up space on the area and planting more trees in perpetuity. So you can constantly be sequestering carbon there, and then you move some of that carbon into constructions and furniture without ever stopping. So you can go past the carrying capacity in terms of carbon sequestration per hectare.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get. Like, what dictates the carrying capacity? We've seen that in past years, for instance, that a lot of the, let's say, research until now and the models seem very conservative in terms of what's possible there. We see some farmers pushing it way beyond. And what's the depth you measure, and how long is, and how stable is the carbon? Of course, the carbon in your wood is pretty stable until you burn it or it rots. Yeah. Like, what determines the creation of these credits, and are there ways to prove, like, to push the system even further and say, actually, we can go beyond this, and actually we can also show what's happening in the soil, etc., because a full-grown forest doesn't store so much in the soil, I think mostly in the biomass, but there might be ways to push the system even further, of course, in this way, to remove some of the carbon and keep it in a carbon cycle, but somewhere else in a beautiful wall or a piece of furniture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think agroforestry, given that it's a polyculture, you're planting multiple species, there's a lot of opportunities to optimize carbon sequestration, whether it's through pruning that can then be converted into biochar, things like this. There's plenty of options for going beyond the traditional carrying capacity of the land.
And what makes Brazil so unique? Like, the system you described is very specific with a number of species, which I think not limits it, but means it grows well in a certain context.
Yep.
And what makes Brazil so unique for this type of agroforestry in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think just one of the most obvious ones to start with is that given the weather and the year-long growing conditions, you can sequester at least twice as much carbon per hectare, per acre, per year versus, let's call it, northern, colder climate. So that's one thing. The variety of the species is also a big differential. And so I think just given the natural abundance and the number of tree species that are here versus in northern climates, I think the difference is like
more options.
Yeah, there's a lot more options. And so the systems tend to be a lot more complex, a lot more biodiverse, native species. And then one of the other factors, which is, just an amazing thing for the world actually, and for our platform, is the interest of the people in the theme of agroforestry. It was actually the theme of one of the most recent soap operas that's watched by millions of people on the main TV station here. It was agroforestry was in the soap opera. So it's something that has really taken hold. People are quite interested in it. And I have not seen this level of interest in other countries.
Shout out to the writers, for creating the storylines in one of the most popular soap operas, telenovelas in Brazil, with storylines of agroforestry and abundance and complexity, and with all the drama that you can imagine with it. If you're interested, Google. I think you can find some. I think it's all global, right? Some scenes, etc. Which
exactly
is very interesting to see how we reach. I'm saying larger people outside the bubble. Yep. And I know the writers have been criticized quite strongly by friends, etc. on why would you work with such a popular media, etc. until parents and mothers, mostly mothers or friends, started to quote certain agroforestry lines. And suddenly you reach I think it reached 200 million people, like a whole different group of people. And it's a thing. Agroforestry is a thing, and creates a whole group of talent. Does it also create interest from investors? Because what seems to be missing and is starting to be resolved to a certain extent is that how do you put the puzzle pieces, like we talked before with the stairs, how do you put the puzzle pieces together of making this bankable, investable, for not just a few people that happen to have a portfolio and believe in this, but actually institutions that, pension funds and the likes. Like when you started going around and say, okay, we're going to do 10,000 actors and way more. And was the appetite? You mentioned it's actually quite well developed in Brazil. What was the appetite from the investor side of things in the financial sector to get behind this?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that it does help when you have the word agroforestry going more mainstream. I think people become curious about it. They've heard it before. It becomes less foreign. And so maybe the early adopter investors would be sort of angel investors that they know it, they have somebody doing it, they've seen it before, and then eventually it works its way towards, let's call it the institutional investors. In terms of investor interest, there is absolutely investor interest in agroforestry. I think that there are some key players that are increasingly involved in agroforestry projects, all the way from institutional investors and asset managers to corporates that are doing offtake agreements or investing upfront in agroforestry projects. There are now venture-backed companies like ours that are in agroforestry, and so the interest is increasing. And I think that this is just the beginning of the level of interest. I think that's something that can scale. It should scale. It needs to scale. And so there should be increasing amounts of capital going into the industry as it becomes more mature, cash flows become more predictable, et cetera.
How different is it now versus 5 years ago? Like when you started 2020, what are the biggest changes you've seen apart from more maturity, like concretely on the ground in terms of these kind of projects and of course Courageous Lands in terms of the growth and scale of the company?
Yeah, I think that there's a few things. One is that as you transition from idea phase into implementation phase and have things to show and technology and track record and all of that, it becomes a different type of conversation. So that's one of the things that happens. So the industry has matured, we've matured, and there's less, let's call it, ideas and more action. The second thing is that investors, like mentioned previously, have started to hear more about agroforestry. So in the initial days, more than half of the conversation with any type of investor was really just explaining what it was, just education. And that's fine at the beginning, but now I expect, and others expect, somebody to show up with some level of education before the call, or they've probably already heard something. And of course, we're going to go into the details and explain things, et cetera. But you're already, 2 steps further, at least in the process, where they understand what it is, and now they're able to evaluate sort of the investment opportunity instead of just being stuck on trying to wrap their head around what agroforestry is.
Trees in agriculture.
Yeah,
how
exactly.
important are carbon credits? You said it's the missing, not missing link, but missing piece that fundamentally changes agroforestry for the first time in 10,000 years, basically. Just to give a bit of more color to that, what do you mean when you say that?
It's an absolute game changer. I think that it's something that is a internalization of a positive externality, and it's something that makes it is the difference between a project being sufficiently financially attractive or not, basically. And so what we've seen is that agroforestry can produce the way that we do it. Now there's plenty of ways to do agroforestry that have less carbon sequestration. We try to optimize carbon sequestration. We use it as a funding source, actually, instead of a revenue source. So what can happen is you can either have a corporate that wants the future carbon credits invest upfront into the project, and then they will be the partner in the project, and they will have the future carbon credits used to offset their emissions. Or you can have a player that wants to pay for the carbon upon delivery, an offtake agreement, and then you have a contract that is essentially a receivable, and then you can take that to a bank and get the financing upfront. So what that means is that you're able to unlock financing for the project that wasn't there before. So the actual amount of money. And second, for the co-investors, because it doesn't unlock all of the capital needs, maybe you're talking about a quarter or a third, but it makes it more attractive for the other 3/4 or 2/3 investors, because they have a co-investor that's helping provide more economic benefits for the project and helping the project be bigger, having more cash flows, et cetera.
And you have seen corporates show up to get these on their books, even though, like in terms of disclosure, in terms of messy markets, let's say we all see headlines on certain voluntary credits. Like what do you make of that when, let's say, an investor says, yeah, it sounds amazing, but what if it just goes away? Or what if it's just a temporary thing and now the world wakes up to tariffs, etc. And this is the first thing that's going to be taken off the to-do list, let's say, and then suddenly it's not there.
Yeah, so I mean, luckily there are still plenty of corporates that are buying carbon credits. They're increasing their demand. We have, at least for us internally, we've had conversations with the biggest carbon buyers in the world, and their demand far, far, far outpaces our ability to supply them. So we're not constrained in terms of demand for carbon credits. We're constrained in terms of the ability to scale even faster to help satisfy the voracious demand of certain large players. So I think that for sure there's companies pulling back, and for sure it'll be a bumpy ride in the carbon markets. And that's one of the advantages of agroforestry, is that the majority of the revenue still does come from the agricultural piece of it. It's the icing on the cake. It helps it be, the carbon is the icing on the cake. It helps it become more attractive, but it's you have other ways of navigating a dip, let's say, than you would if you're a pure carbon player. And so I think that the message is like just to sort of understand who are the players that want the carbon, and then get to a place, which is not easy, right? When you're starting up, it was very difficult, a lot of outbound reach. And now to get to a place where there's more inbound demand. So I don't have to try to convince someone to buy carbon credits. They'll let me know if they're interested, and it'll be pretty straightforward from the beginning.
And do you remember, of course you do, but like your first big carbon credit, like an important carbon credit deal that happened, like how you must, or maybe the first even, depends on how big the first was, like a fundamental one. And can you walk us through the process, what happened there? If you want to name names, name names. If you don't want to name names, definitely don't name names. But just as because it's such an important piece that then unlocks, as you mentioned, a lot of other funding, potentially the funding directly or through basically a purchase agreement or an offtake of carbon credits. You can go to a bank if the bank understands what you're doing, and then hopefully finance a big chunk of it. Like how did that first one happen?
Yeah, so I'll talk about one that's actually not announced yet. It'll be announced at some point this year.
Ooh, a scoop.
Yeah. So essentially, we have been working in two key regions in Brazil: the Amazon biome and the Atlantic biome. And the Amazon is obviously...
How different are the systems? And we're going to ask a very technical question. I'm going to interrupt, which is...
Relatively...
similar? Yeah. Like, do you grow the same levels that you just mentioned, like coffee, hardwood, etc.?
Well, it depends. So we always do the 3 layers, the 3 stratums. And in the state of Bahia in the Atlantic, it's a very similar climate to the Amazon climate. So we are able to grow pretty much the same things with some adaptation of native timber species for each biome. And the acai in Roraima is different from the acai in the Atlantic. It's called Jussara in the Atlantic. It's different variation.
But there was a rainforest there as well, so it's
exactly.
Not so here. Yeah.
Exactly. But also in the Atlantic biome, just like the Amazon biome, is quite big, but it's even more diverse in terms of the type of climate. So the Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro are in the Atlantic biome, the Atlantic forest biome. So here it's different species because it's a lot drier, it gets a bit colder in the winter, et cetera. So there we have just a different variation, but always sort of focused on the key main crops. And so, for example, in the southeast, we'll plant Arabica coffee, and in the northeast in the Amazon, we'll plant Robusta coffee, which is, yeah.
We'll go back to the fine you're working on this one, but if you had to only optimize for carbon, how different would like the system look like? Would it be more complex with more layers? Would it be more direction of syntropic? Like what would be different? Or is it actually we are at an optimum where carbon and production makes sense, but what would you tweak if, let's say, carbon prices were the main source?
I don't think that we would tweak too much, because what's interesting is that in our models is that, of course, the timber species and the soil has a vast amount of carbon stored in those carbon pools, but also the fruit trees themselves, which are shade tolerant, allow for another layer of carbon sequestration to be happening in the understory, that if you were doing pure silviculture, you might not even have that understory. And so I think we're close to optimized. I guess the only place that we could go would be towards more pure reforestation, essentially, which is something that eventually, is not agroforestry, which is not our focus, because we want to really transition the way food is grown into a new way. But anyway,
let's go back. Sorry, to the carbon ones you're working on for this year.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's absolutely massive project. We're talking about $60 million project in the Amazon, which is
16 or 60?
60. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's
not that 16 is not a lot, but this is a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, it's been a amazing journey from the pilot, which started 3 years ago, to engaging investors, which started about 2 years ago, to now being able to really do something on a scale that is very rare for agroforestry. and to have the impact that we want to have on the ground, not only from a carbon sequestration standpoint and ecological, but also from a social impact standpoint. And so there we're working with local communities, Venezuelan refugees, and really helping transition the local economy from deforestation and cattle ranching and illegal mining into agroforestry. And we have multiple people on our team that used to work doing things that were illegal because it was the only job they had and they need to provide for their family. And now they're doing the exact opposite. They're planting trees, they're doing agroforestry. And, we built out an incredible carbon team internally that can help take care of the documentation. We have great partners, which we'll be able to announce later, that are also experienced with carbon and investments in these types of projects. And it's just excited to get it off the ground. It's a grouped carbon project, meaning that there'll be multiple farms under the same umbrella. And it's an ARR project, meaning it sits under the category of reforestation, essentially.
And how important, you mentioned technology and platform a couple of times. What has changed there, let's say in the last 5 years, of course, 10,000 years as well? And we now have AI. I mean, we had AI for a while, but let's say now it's in the public eye as well. There's a massive technology boom, which seems, we were talking about it with Antonio Nobler, one of the researchers on the flying rivers, etc., was very bullish on AI. It went down well. And we've been having a few conversations left and right on the role of technology and deep tech and what it currently means. Interestingly enough, a number of your buyers are also deep into the technology world because they have the margins and they've made some very big commitments, especially Microsoft and some others in terms of carbon. How important? What's the role of technology in agroforestry scale up, and what is possible now? If you have to tell an investor, it's always the question: okay, why now and not yesterday? Why should I not wait 2 years? Like, what's the current role of technology, and where do you see it? Do you see it going in agroforestry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, technology makes a huge difference in increasing the scalability and attractiveness of agroforestry. So the previous company that I was involved with prior to Courageous Land was really helping create the platform and the digital tools and the technology and the software to drive a new industry, a new career, essentially. And we see that agroforestry is very much needing this. And so we launched our agroforestry intelligence platform at the end of last year at New York Climate Week in September. And we've already got now over 450 farms on the waiting list wanting to do agroforestry with us, have access to the software that we've built, et cetera. And so they're representing something like 150,000 hectares across Brazil. And so what we noticed early on is that, we started off with 2 farms, right? We had the one in Bahia and the one in Roraima. And we realized that essentially the front office and the back office of both farms could be run by the same group of people in a very efficient way, especially as we think, okay, we're going to have 3, 4, 5, up to 100 farms. Like, what is needed to be developed in order to streamline agroforestry? And we came up with 4 main bottlenecks that agroforestry has in terms of main key challenges. The planning of the agroforestry system. So how do you know what trees to plant, what the cash flows will look like, what the carbon will look like, if each tree is getting enough sunlight and shade. The second is the financing of it. So how do you get the capital needed to do the agroforestry project? The third is the management of a very complex system, right? Much more complex than a monoculture. How do you know that you didn't forget to do something that's important when you're taking care of a coffee tree, an acai tree, 6 different types of timber species, bananas, etc. And then the last piece is getting everything to market. It's selling the crops and the carbon. So it's already difficult as a farmer to sell one thing. Imagine if you have to try to sell 5 things plus carbon credits. So what we did is we created this agroforestry intelligence platform that really makes available to the public now planning tools, access to capital for agroforestry, management software, and expertise in field, so technical assistance, and then access to the market. And we've seen tremendous demand for this, essentially. And so it's really, really interesting the way that you can automate and increase the speed of getting agroforestry projects to market, essentially.
And what is possible now that wasn't possible a year or 2 years ago, like in terms of technology? Or is it relatively, not saying straightforward or low tech, but the getting from, like we see in certain grazing software, not to reduce that at all, but going from paper planning, if you do rotational plant grazing, to a software type approach, and going basically from paper and Excel to online software already makes a huge difference. You take pictures of the pasture, it might tell you certain things, but it's not super automated that you can connect it to your virtual fencing and it can run itself. And like in agroforestry, how big of a step is it, and how much is possible now that wasn't possible maybe a few years ago? And then, of course, let's still, where is it going, or where do you see it going in the next years?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, the first product, the software product that we launched, was it's called a diagnostic. Essentially, any piece of land, starting in Brazil, you just need to upload the shape file or draw it on the map, and then within 25 seconds, we have a report with everything that you really need to know about that piece of land and its potential for agroforestry. So it shows the total number of hectares eligible for carbon credits, the species that would be the best species to plant there, altitude maps, rainfall patterns, the expected weather now and in 2040, biodiversity
Very
numbers, soil type, irrigation potential, like everything you can possibly imagine. So this report we give for free to anyone in Brazil, starting in Brazil, rolling it out after that. But and it's something that you get for free in 30 seconds, essentially. What it used to take was probably in dollars, maybe $5,000 to $10,000 and 2 months for some expert to come produce the exact same report. So this is a perfect example of how technology...
as accurate as that expert. Like, this is something you can take to your practitioner and your tree nursery and say, okay, ordering me these trees and let's go. Let's finance it. Let's go.
So I would say, Kitch, it's the famous 80-20 rule. Maybe it's 90-10 in this rule, where you, before actually starting the project, you would still want a expert to come visit the land, or if you know land yourself, then you can be there. But this is perfect for prospecting new areas, understanding if somebody wants to do a partnership with you, what you're working with, without having to go visit there. It basically took a report creation that was manual and collecting multiple data points about a given region or a given piece of land and making it automated and immediate. And so, and also adding data points that were not available previously.
And so it was the first product, and then what have you been adding on top of that?
Yep. So coming up next is essential. Well, we already have it internally, and soon we'll make it available to others. So it starts with the diagnostic, which is a form of planning. We now have a planning software which helps you model different agroforestry systems and understand the cash flows, the management practices that are needed, the labor needs, the carbon expectations, et cetera. The next piece of that is the financing piece. So we have a waiting list of farms that are wanting financing to do agroforestry systems, and we've been able to provide capital to some of those farms, and soon we'll be taking more and more off of the waiting list and providing capital through the platform. The next piece is management software. So essentially, at any given moment, knowing exactly what has been done until that point, and the next steps on the agroforestry farm. So what are the next steps to take care of the coffee plants? What are the next steps to take care of the acai trees? What are the expected volumes? That way the commercial team has this ready to go. They have a dashboard, what needs to be sold when. And then the last piece is obviously plugging into the market. So all of this is built out in, let's call it either a advanced or a beta form, depending on the functionality, and all of it will be totally done pretty soon and available for everyone, which we're excited about.
And so then on the ground, we often hear agroforestry is more labor intensive, which is not necessarily a bad thing if we can pay labor well. How do you deal with that, or what's your view? And are there, of course, also technology solutions there, or maybe more low tech? But often not a complaint with people like, yeah, but what about automation? And what about the machinery and all of that? It only works in Brazil because labor is cheap and blah, 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 which I don't think is the case. But what do you do when investors throw the labor, let's say the labor card to you?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Labor is a necessary piece of this. And I think that, like you said, it's a good thing for the most part, as long as you are paying correctly and training people. So I think that there's a few things that need to happen as you think about this trade-off between labor and technological advancements. The first one is independent of the quantity of labor and the fact that we can mechanize more over time and use robotics more over time. The labor that's there, I think, needs to have a clear career path. When I started at any company, you get a training on your first day. They help you set up a retirement account. They show you the different paths. You get to meet people that are the vice president to the managing director, et cetera. Like, why does this not exist when you start on an agroforestry farm or any farm? And so really creating paths to wealth accumulation and having a clear vision that anyone working on these projects will participate in the upside, which we have a policy for, and also have a path towards being a manager or director, et cetera. So I think that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is, in order to attract that talent and have the right type of talent, there needs to be a lot of specific education. And unfortunately for now, we've taken it on as our responsibility to train these people internally. There's not many people that are out there in the market or graduating from universities that are ready to go and operate or manage agroforestry farms. And so instead of having more lateral hires, why don't we have more great young talent and build out that talent pool internally? So that way we have somebody who maybe is only 25 years old, but actually far more qualified than somebody who's 32 that worked on a different type of agriculture project and has no experience with agroforestry. And then in terms of the machinery and the robotics, we're absolutely paying attention to and in touch with a lot of the players that are developing these types of machinery robotics. For now, we're able to use existing machines and they work for the most part fine. And so I don't believe that agroforestry needs to go through some machinery revolution in order to work. I think I think we need action on the ground, and the tools that we have now are sufficient. That being said, I think over time things will become increasingly scalable using AI and robotics, and the intersection of AI and robotics plugged into our software in order to execute some of the tasks that need to be executed that are either dangerous or a little bit repetitive, let's say.
Yeah, I think we can only imagine what 5 or 10 years looks like in terms of robotics and AI as we see the last few years and the last few months, and just the last few days. It seems a constant speed up. And agriculture and agroforestry seems perfect for the repetitive, dangerous climbing trees, or I don't know if you want flying drones with massive chainsaws, but we're definitely going to see pruning drones, I think, anytime soon. And you already see some harvesting ones, and you see some observing the great cameras. It's almost standard now. And so what would you tell if we do this in front, I like to say, in front of a live audience in the theater in Sao Paulo, in the financial heart of Brazil? We have a room full of smart investors interested in agroforestry, of course. We had a great meal before, a lot of amazing footage. I still remember some footage of Fernando Russo standing in a subtropical agroforestry farm, like amazing pictures, things like that, so videos. And what would be your main, not advice, we don't give investment advice, but your main seed you want to plant in their minds? So the next day when they're in the office or wherever they do their business, maybe remotely, but they remember, because from evenings like that, we remember, we get very enthusiastic, but then we don't do that much usually. What would be the seed you would like to plant in their mind that they actually preferably take action with? People that manage their own wealth or other people's wealth.
Yeah, I think that the big takeaway is that we do not need necessarily any changes in regulation, any changes in consumer taste, any changes in machinery. We have a solution that is ready to be scaled. And it's something that I think is an empowering thought, because a lot of people say, oh, okay, well, maybe if we wait a little bit further, then we'll have some change, or we need to lobby the government to subsidize this. No, I think that there is a sufficient opportunity today. And I think that there's big first mover advantages in terms of building, track record, and also experience and learning things the hard way and some things the easy way. And so, yeah, get your boots dirty, get out your shovel, and start planting trees. I think I think there's no better time than right now.
When in doubt, plant more trees.
Yeah.
Yes, but it also gives a sort of, like, if you know this, you cannot unsee it, as you said before. You cannot unknow it. It also brings that uncomfortable feeling that, yeah, you have to get going now. Like, this is the moment to know. We know what we know. We know the direction. It's pretty clear. Makes a lot of sense. Yes, there are risks, but it's not that we need to wait for magic technology to come up or to show up, like, with very relatively basic tools, which only get better over time. It's already possible, and it's definitely needed. So it also, yeah, I can see the double piece there. Or it sounds too good to be true. They were like, yeah, but if it's so easy, or it's not so easy, and it's so logical, why are not others, etc., doing more? And how important is, in your mix of trees, etc., the offtake side of things? Like, a lot of these markets are very established. Is there need for more? Like, is there some offtake? The carbon credit offtake, I completely understand, but like other offtakes, do they help you, just as we saw in solar, with like power purchase agreements at an industrial scale? Like, is there any offtake that would make your life easier?
So you get differing opinions. You don't need the offtake depending on the investor. So certain investors, let's call it a traditional bank or a development bank, they may say, oh, you're going to plant coffee. Great. Do you have an offtake agreement? And you can get an offtake agreement for coffee or cocoa or one of these commodities, but the buyer will lock in a price that's, relatively low commodity price. And you might talk to other investors that are maybe more experienced with coffee and cocoa, and they said, "Oh,
please don't take the offtake."
Yeah, don't take the offtake. Every single coffee bean finds the market. There's no reason to have an offtake. You will sell your coffee. And so I think the answer around the offtake is it kind of depends on the crop. I think if you're talking about large commodities, especially ones that can store well over time, that you don't have a very short window to sell, then I don't think they're necessary. I think for other crops, depending on the investor that will back you, they may ask for very strong evidence that you will have a commercially viable outlet for the crops.
Yeah, because you don't want to lock in a low price. Obviously, with the current boom, that would be sad. And to flip the question, what would you do? I know you thought about it. If you'd be in charge of $1 billion in this case, not looking for exact dollar amounts, not looking for investment advice, obviously, but what would you prioritize? What would be the biggest buckets, let's say, of your investment strategy if you had to put a significant amount of money to work? And I'm assuming in agroforestry, that could be something else as well.
Yes, I think the opportunity is really in these projects that can simultaneously sequester carbon and have revenue sources from carbon credits and production. So I think agroforestry is the first one that comes to mind, regenerative agriculture generally, but also aquaculture can do the same. You can restore marine ecosystems, sequester carbon, and produce regenerative food. But with a twist, I think that with all of these types of opportunities, I would look for, let's call it platformed or scalable approaches where you have velocity building and you can bring in players from multiple sides in order to scale this. So for example, with agroforestry, we have the opportunity to bring in landowners, certified professionals that are helping service those farms, technology, offtake agreements, financing, sort of all in one place, and really unlock the agroforestry economy, the agroforestry ecosystem. Who are the players doing that for aquaculture, for example, or regenerative agriculture in general? I think that there's an opportunity there to really scale things in a way that has what's traditionally known as platform scale to really move the needle. And so that's what I'd be looking at right now.
And in the scene of agroforestry, of course, in sort of the best place to be in that sense, you go for sure to conferences, etc. Where are you contrarian? Where do you think different, or what do you believe to be true, as we like to call this question? Ask this question that's inspired by John Kempf. What do you believe to be true in this case about regen agroforestry that others don't? Maybe nothing, but I can imagine there might be some other thoughts.
Yeah, I think just coming back to the point I mentioned earlier is that at a lot of these conferences, people are talking about how we need to change policy. We need to invent machines that don't exist yet and all that. I think I'm contrarian there because those things will help, but they're not necessary. And I think that we have what we need to go forward. I think that there is not more need for talk. I think there's a lot of need for action and using the resources that we have in order to do the best we can with what we have right now.
In terms of that, like what's limiting the scale or the growth, let's say, of agroforestry in Brazil? Is it access to land? Is it legislation to a certain extent, talent, tree nurseries? Like what's limiting you, or capital? What's limiting you most in terms of doing the 2, 10, 20, 100x that you would love to do?
Great question. So I'll answer it in two ways. I think what's limiting agroforestry as a whole in Brazil, I think that there are some management techniques specifically related to syntropic that are very difficult to scale, like climbing trees to prune and stuff like that. Like we don't do that. We have definitive spacing of our tree species. We produce biomass from cover crops instead of from climbing eucalyptus trees. Like those types of things are inherently, by definition, difficult to scale. And so I think creating a methodology and a way of doing agroforestry business that is scalable is something that is important to us, and I think is important to the world. And I think that there's no right or wrong way to do agroforestry, but there are ways that are more, let's call it scalable, let's say. In terms of limitations on our side, I think that ultimately the execution capacity of people that are very, very good in the field that want to be living in rural areas doing agroforestry for long periods of time is something that is increasingly important in order to scale this, right? Like right now, it's not an issue, but as you can think, as you get bigger and bigger, you'll need more and more people. I think it's also a tremendous opportunity. Like the amount of fun that the people have on our farms is great. Like I love being on the farm as much as possible because people are enjoying themselves. They're out in nature. They're fit. They're intellectually stimulated. It's extremely heady intellectual stuff, scientifically based, like everything we're doing. And so it really is a fantastic lifestyle, but you need to have more and more people like that. And
otherwise, it's very lonely if you're the only one.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Or 1,000-mile radius or wind limit. And we see the same in regen.
Yeah.
Like in the farming, like the arable, or let's say or northern hemisphere farming. I heard it on a podcast. Somebody asked me, what would change your life as a regen farmer in of course, the countryside? And he said, if 4 or 5 other people would be around me, that would change, like fundamentally change my quality of life. They are working on this.
Absolutely.
Because the countryside is empty in many places. Empty, a few people left, mostly retired, mostly relatively monoculture people in that sense. Not think bad, but a lot of people left. Like the entrepreneurs have left, unfortunately. And so new energy can be lonely unless we come with a group, and of course that brings challenges as well. So yeah, you need to willing to want that and build community basically from scratch.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of what we're building with the platform is really this network of agroforestry farms, people that are not only landowners, but also that want to participate as consultants in the projects, people that want to participate as operators and executors of the project. And so get in contact, please, cl@courageousland.com. If anyone wants to talk about what this means in terms of building this community, this network for agroforestry, because it is a critical piece of it, and it can be a lot of fun, I think, and that's what we're doing.
And as a final question, if you had a magic wand that you could change one thing overnight, so we take away the fund, but you have a magic power, don't ask for more, like don't change it, like don't be Aladdin. But if you had one wish, let's say, or one time the magic power to change something overnight, what would it be?
So I think that there's, I guess, 2 points here. The first is very simply.
Everybody does it all the time.
Very simply, and not so simple, I guess. Internalizing the externalities, both the positive and the negative externalities, into the price of food. So when you get a conventional piece of food that's monoculture associated with deforestation, the price in the supermarket is cheap, but it's artificially, it's not really actually cheap. If you look at the health consequences, the environmental consequences, you start to add those prices back in, versus the regenerative or agroforestry product, which has so many benefits to it and looks on paper to be more expensive, but is saving the government healthcare costs and many other things. I think that the other piece of maybe to make it more practical of how you can show people the externalities of what their choice is if you could have, in an ideal scenario, like a 3D goggle set next to the food where you can see the farm, you can visit the farm where it was grown at and say, okay, this is coffee from a regenerative agroforestry farm and this is coffee from a monoculture conventional farm. People will make the decision on their own if they can just be there and see. They're intuitively,
Smell,
one is
sense,
better.
Hear.
Exactly. So that, and if not 3D goggles, then at least a photo or a QR code on things where you can just start to see what the farms look like, where each of the things are coming from, and you can make a choice based on that.
That would be a fascinating guest to hear and listen, and of course smell would be nice. But let's say to bring somebody else mentioned it. Of course, now I'm blanking on where. Like if you could see behind the shelf, what is behind that product, or behind that coffee bean, or behind the Brazil nut, or behind the grain, and behind etc. etc. And just have that comparison. A lot more people would probably not mind a slight increase in cost, at least the people that can afford. Of course, there's a huge discussion on accessibility and affordability, and I'm not saying ever, but what I'm saying is that there are many people with the income that should know better, first of all, and should definitely purchase better. And that's a big group that, just added dollars on let's say the more regenerative supply webs that we're not capturing now because somehow we're not attractive enough or not interesting enough, or somehow there's no click. And this could be, a strong click literally in your face. Because the difference is so stark, of course, coming from a monoculture coffee plantation or walking around virtually in the supermarket aisle on one of your farms.
I think it's just a question of time. I think technology is getting better and better in an accelerated way. And to be able to have full traceability and visibility into where things are coming from is just a question of time.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think it's a great moment actually to wrap up. And I want to thank you so much for, of course, listening to the podcast and for sort of not coming full circle. That makes it sound very dramatic. But definitely diving headfirst into the space and heart first as well, and building something very fundamental and courageous, pun intended, and coming back on here to talk about it and share, and hopefully, can share more in due time on the big projects you're working on. And I think Brazil, I'm not saying has an endless opportunity for agroforestry, but pretty limitless in terms of space and in terms of land that can be reforested and be re-agroforested, which is not a word. But thank you so much for coming on here, Phil, and sharing about your journey.
Thank you so much for all the work that you do and for being an inspiration to many of us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end. For show notes and links discussed, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend? And get in touch with us on social media, our website, or via the Spotify app, and tell us what you liked most. And give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or your podcast player. That really, really helps us. Thanks again, and see you next time.